Hello everyone, my name is Chelsea and welcome back to my channel. For today's video, we're going to talk about indie books. So today is going to be one of those book talk videos where we just sort of talk about things. Hopefully you guys give me some answers and opinions on things that I'm going to be talking about today, because really I am interested in what you think, because we're going to be talking about indie books. Indie versus traditionally published, what that means, and the reason why this came about is because the new book in the Imperium series, Onyx Storm, recently came out. This is the third book following Fourth Wing and Iron Flame, and it just got me thinking, because one of the things that I do is I track book stats, and I had a whole stat video come out at the beginning of this year for everything that I read last year. I like to track my indie versus traditionally published, and I was playing around with a spreadsheet also recently, both the one that I use and a different one because it has more stats that I'm not entirely too sure I want to use, but it also has a series tracker and things. So I've been playing around with stats a bunch recently. And one thing that I do love to track for myself is indie versus traditionally published. And it just really got me thinking. So the first thing that we should probably talk about is what does that mean? We basically categorize things as either traditionally published or indie published. Indie can mean a couple different things. It could be that it's self-published, which I feel like a lot of people track it that way, or it could be that it is from an independent, smaller publisher. I'm also in this indie fantasy group on Facebook, and this is another reason that I'm curious about what other people think, is because some people were asking about certain books that are indie published, because that is what that group is for, and they are being very, very strict about what actually they are considering indie. Even if it is an independent publisher, which would technically be considered indie, if it's a bigger publisher, then I guess what they want for their group, if it's not a singular author publishing something, they're saying it doesn't count. And so it's just I've been thinking about a lot of things. So we should definitely talk about what does indie versus traditional mean. This is my book talk video. This is the thing where I ramble. I have lots of points that I want to make, and it's probably going to take us a circuitous way to get there. But basically, when you're talking about traditionally published, you're mostly talking about the big 5 publishers. This used to be the big 6 back when I was younger, but we had mergers and things like that. I think Penguin and Random House merged in about 2013. So I actually remember when there was just Penguin publishers and just Random House publishers. But so now they are considered one of the big 5. The other big 5s are also Simon & Schuster, HarperCollins, Macmillan, and I say Hachette. I know that's probably not correct because that's not how you spell Hatchet. In my head, it's Hachette, maybe. But those are your big 5. Those are the publishers that basically run everything. I want to say it was almost a big 4 semi-recently. Another publisher, one of these ones, was going to buy out the other one, and they were told no because of monopolies. So we still have the big 5. If a book is part of the big 5, they are not indie. That is just what it is. Now, when you get into the nitty-gritty of stuff to really looking at these publishers, it can get a little bit more complicated than that. I was part of the Indie Accords readathon when it first started a few years ago, and I made this whole big spreadsheet talking about what is traditionally published, what is indie published, and all of the imprints of the big 5. What an imprint is are basically smaller subsets of these publishers. You will get a book, let's say this one here, Nevermore by Jessica Townsend. It is published by Little Brown. If you actually go on Google, which is usually where I find it, and look up Little Brown Publishing or who owns Little Brown, you will find that Hachette, whatever you want to call it, owns them. So Little Brown is an imprint of a big 5 company. So this is a traditionally published book. This happens a lot. You can also find Avon. Avon publishes romance books. However, they are also an imprint. They are owned by HarperCollins. So they are part of the big 5. A lot of books, when you go into a bookstore, even if you're not entirely too sure, you will see that they are part of the big 5 traditionally published companies. I will say there's some other companies that are not necessarily the big five, but they're big enough that I do not consider them indie, like Disney or Scholastic. These are actually companies that usually do mostly children's or middle grade books, and so don't always come into the conversation when you're talking about young adult, things that like you would think adults read, but they are so big of a company that even though they're not technically part of the big five, they are not indie. Also, if you go into the book, you can actually find this stuff on the copyright page as well. So yes, it does say Little Brown here. You will usually find a publisher on the spine, but if you go into the copyright page, it'll actually tell you who owns it right here. If I can show you this, it's under Little Brown and then also Hatchet Book Group. It tells you right there that it is part of the big five. I have another book here. It's by Razorbill. Razorbill, if we go into here, this actually tells you very easily, there's your little penguin icon. It is owned by Penguin Random House. Here's another book, an adult book, Tor. If you go into the publishing, it does say it is from Tor, but it also says Tor is a registered trademark of Macmillan. So they are trying to trick you a little bit with those imprints, but things that you see a lot, Tor, things like that, you will find they are traditionally published. So when I'm going and tracking things in my system, my stats, I will do the same sort of thing for my manga. Things like Viz are very, very popular. Kodansha. So those, again, are not part of the big five necessarily. However, if we're going for like manga stats, they are some of the biggest companies that publish manga. So pretty much everything else is indie published. Again, this could vary a little bit. You do have things like Amazon Publishing, where Amazon is such a big company and they are starting to do like those Amazon original stories. You could consider them part of a big five or part of a traditionally published thing. But then there's also a lot of authors that do self-publishing through Amazon, through the Kindle Unlimited, that kind of stuff. Those are obviously going to be indie. So there is, like I said, a little bit of wiggle room here, but in general, what you're looking for to see if something is traditionally published is how big the company is and if it is an imprint of these other companies. But now let's get into Fourth Wing and things like that. The things that I was thinking of when I was like considering where do I put everything in my stats. So Fourth Wing is published by Red Tower Books. Red Tower Books is owned by Entangled. Entangled is, if you go onto the Google, is a boutique romance publisher. And it also states that it is an independent publisher of romantic fiction. From my understanding, is also woman-owned. So when you go into here, it is telling you right off the bat, boutique is a good word for this. Also, obviously, the fact that it is an independent company. These are indie books. Now, they are distributed by Macmillan. Keep in mind, an imprint of Macmillan is different than distributed by. So sometimes this does happen, especially with indie publishers that are not just like a self-published book, the author is publishing their book themselves. They will actually partner with the big five to get their books into bookstores. So if something is distributed by a big five company, they're not owned by the big five company. So when you see things like Fourth Wing, or there's some other publishers out as well where they're like, publishing these books that feel and look traditionally published, it does not necessarily mean that they are. And so there is this like overlap of this. Like your Rebecca Yarros has pretty much always been indie published. However, she has self-published a lot of her books before getting into Fourth Wing and things like that. Like Red Tower, all these books, they're technically indie books. However, I do know a lot of people use the word and term indie to only mean self-published. I think this came about because saying something was self-published for a long time was looked down negatively. Like you weren't able to get a deal with an actual publisher, so obviously your book is not as good of quality. I do not think this. I think there's quite a few people that don't think this, but I do think there is this stigma to say self-published. So when I say indie, and that's how I track things, when I say indie, I do mean self-published, but I also mean an independent publisher. There's quite a few books also that are just from smaller publishers that you can find at the bookstore that aren't traditionally published, they're just from a smaller publisher. Those smaller publishers are indie. And I definitely had a ton of people asking about this when I was part of that Indie Accords readathon a few years ago, because you would get people being like, well, what about this? What about that? And you will also sometimes find that like one version of the book is from the big five in the US, but then a smaller publisher was the partner for it in like the UK or another country. If they're partnering up with the big five specifically and not just in a distribution sense, they are most likely still a traditionally published book, even if it is a smaller publisher in another country. All that kind of stuff gets into this gray area as well, which is a little bit interesting. But so yeah, finding out that Fourth Wing, because I finished that this month. That was one of the books that you guys told me to read, and I was so glad I did. But I finished it this month, and I was putting in stuff in my stats, and I was like, where do I put this? I did still put it as Entangled. When I go into my stats and put in the publisher, I always look for the parent company because of the fact that I want to know what books are coming from the big five. And a lot of these big fives have a ton of imprints. So I went up, I didn't say Red Tower on my stats, I said Entangled because that was the biggest company for that area, which is an independently owned company. It is not a big five publisher. So I did put it as Entangled in my publisher thing, but then when I went to, is it indie or traditional? I did put indie. And like I said, some of these publishers have a ton of imprints. Do I still have? I might still have my traditionally published spreadsheet that I made. Okay, I think I actually still have my spreadsheet for all of the traditional publishers and imprints that I created back in 2021. I modified it in 2022 for the next year. I will leave this link down below because I was the one that made this, but I went into all of the different big companies and all of their imprints. So like when you go into Hachette, I don't know. The imprints, at least back in 2021 and 2022, included Back Bay Books, Basic Books, Black Dog and Leventhal, Center Street, Faith Words, Forever, Grand Central Publishing, Jimmy Patterson, Little Brown and Company, Mulholland Books, Perseus Books, Orbit, Red Hook, Running Press, 12, Voracious, Worthy, and Yen Press. Like, there are tons of imprints for some of these ones. HarperCollins, Amistad, Avon, Balzer and Bray, Broadside Books, Caedmon, Carina Press, Custom House, Day Street, Echo, Graydon House, Willow Green Books, Hanover Square Press, Harlequin, Heartdrum, HQN, which I think is another Harlequin one, Inkyard Press, Catherine Teagan Books, Love Inspired, Mira Books, Park Row Books, Quiltree Books, Walden Pond Press, and William Morrow. Obviously, anything else that has Harper in the name, like Harper Teen, Harper Voyager, Harper Wave, Harper Perennial, those are all owned by HarperCollins. Now, I'm not going to go into everything else, but this was my way of showing people that you can find books that have a smaller publisher name, but because we were really focusing on indie presses and self-published books, we wanted people to know that. We also had exceptions for anything that was published by DC because Penguin Random House distributed them, but also they were huge. Disney, Marvel, Scholastic, anything that was super, super big. We also had some imprints of Scholastic because Scholastic is quite big. It's not part of the big five, but it has its own imprints. So I will leave that link down below for anybody that wants to peruse. But I think that also brings up the part of the thing that I really want people's opinions on and what do you guys think? First of all, what do you consider indie? I'm going from what we were considering the actual standard of usage with the words in relation to publishing. And so that's where I use it for. So when I go into my stats, I do say Fourth Wing is indie. It is not part of the big five. It is not part of a big publisher. It is not self-published anymore, but indie doesn't have to mean self-published. My other thing that I really wanted to bring up, and this is where I guess I want some more opinions for it, because now that I've really been thinking about stuff, especially in relation to Fourth Wing, I'm like, what do I do? I'm talking about books that get picked up by traditional publishers. So now, I originally read Wolfsong back when it was self-published, indie published. Now all of the books are traditionally published. My question, I guess, is like, how much are these traditional publishers doing to the contents of this book? Yes, we have a brand new, cool, really nice looking cover. I love the covers of these. Also, this is the Barnes & Noble edition. We technically have a new short story that runs through these books, but I'm pretty sure the content in here is what the original indie book was. When you're indie, especially if you're self-published indie, I'm not entirely too sure how it works with like actual independent publishing companies like Rebecca Yarros working with Entangled and Red Tower Books. You don't get assigned an editor and things like that. Good indie authors, good self-published authors should still be somehow editing their book and, you know, proofreading it and maybe having friends do it. I know sometimes they like partner up with another author and they switch books and like really do that, or they hire people that can help them do that. But I do think the contents of books like these haven't really been changed. Back when I did the Indie Accords readathon, we were not allowing any books that had been picked up by traditional publishers to be considered as indie, but also in that year, we had barely had Legends and Lattes picked up. Legends and Lattes came out like February or something, the year it came out, and by the end of that same year, it was traditionally published. Again, I don't know how much of a difference it had compared to like everything else, but we've had such a big influx now of indie books, especially like indie romances and things like that, being picked up by traditional publishers, getting a new cover, slapping it on there and putting it out. How much are they actually changing? Like Mariana Zapata has some new traditionally published books. Like I read All Roads Lead Here last year with the new cover, an arc from the new publisher, but like it was already indie published. I think they also did The Wall of Winnipeg and Me and maybe like one other one. We have the Ice Planet Barbarian series. Like yes, they're now having new covers and things, but these are books that have been out for years that were indie or self-published. Like I'm just at the point where I'm like, technically when I read something now, I probably have the traditional publish book, but does that actually mean I should be counting it as traditionally published in my stats? Like I'm curious because I'm now confused on what I want to do with that. What do you guys think? If I was going to be reading books and like, let's say I did pick up the next book in the Ice Planet Barbarian series. I have 2 of them on my TBR right now. I read 3 of them a few years ago before they were picked up by a traditional publisher. The content is probably pretty much the same as it was before. This has been a very beloved, independently published series. Do I consider it indie still because that was the origin of it? Or do I say, nope, it's a traditionally published book now? Same thing with Legends and Lattes. I think I technically rated it and like said I read it last year as a traditionally published book, but like, what did they change? We have this big influx now of sort of traditionally published looking books. I'll have to like dive into specifics of like what companies are doing this potentially on my own time, maybe not like right now, that are picking up all these indie books. But like some of them were picking them up very quickly. The announcement to like publication was very, very quick because I don't think they're changing anything on the inside of the book. They're just giving it a new cover and reaching a wider audience, which is great. That's basically what a distributed by thing means. Like if you have Entangled, who is distributed by Macmillan, they're helping it reach a wider audience, reach a wider amount of bookstores because they're able to distribute it, get it in boxes, get it on trucks much easier than an actual just like indie publish. So yeah, that is my book talk. Like I said, whenever I do these, I love doing these, but my brain really just does run in circles all the time. I'm pretty sure I hit all the different things I wanted to talk about. Yeah, indie, trad, big 5. What does it mean to be owned by them, be an imprint of them versus being distributed by? And then like my real question is I need help. I will hopefully figure something out soon. Please let me know. Do you consider books that have been picked up by a traditional publisher but started off as indie, especially if they had been indie for a while, would you still count them as indie, or do you count them as a traditional publisher now? Because I have definitely come to that point where I have things on my shelves, I have things that I want to read that technically, if I would have read them a few years ago, they would be indie. And I do think indie counts for independently published companies, smaller companies, does not just have to be self-published books. Although, like I said, that group that I'm in on Facebook, they were cutting down on like who could say that they read certain things. Then again, this was an indie fantasy group. They were also cutting down on like what paranormal fantasy and urban fantasy and high fantasy means and like which ones were allowed in that group. I'm there for the book recs, so like it doesn't really affect me as much, but they were being like, if it has romance, it's not counted as fantasy. And I'm like, because they were considering anything that has romance as like a main feature to be, oh no, that's paranormal, not fantasy. I don't know. They wanted a magic system, but no magical creatures. Okay, we're not here to talk about that today. We were here to talk about indie stuff. If I told you I was reading Wolf Song, what would you think? Indie or traditional? I'm still at a loss. That's it for today. Let me know down below because I really do need help with this. And if you guys like this video, give it a thumbs up to let me know. Subscribe to this channel if you'd like to see more videos. I do have videos coming out Tuesdays, Thursdays, and Saturdays. So I will see you then. Bye.